I'll talk about a few things to kick the discussion off, but obviously environmental questions, ecological questions are all-encompassing. So people should feel free to ask questions or make contributions based on any aspect that I do or don't get to mention. You know, the conference here that I'm very happy to be at and be invited to speak at is obviously to do with food, and I think one of the most egregious aspects of this kind of barbaric system that we currently have to exist under is the situation with our food. Just to quote from an epigram that I put in my book, this is John Block, U.S. Agriculture Secretary, talking about food negotiations in 1986. The idea that developing countries should feed themselves is an anachronism from a bygone era. They could better ensure their food security by relying on U.S. agricultural products, which are available in most cases at lower cost. And so, on the one hand, developing countries are being told by the United States Agriculture Department that they don't have to worry about feeding their own populations. And then on the other hand, that they should rely on subsidized food from U.S. multinational agricultural corporations like ADM and so on and so forth. And what has that actually resulted in? If you look at just any number of examples around the world, just look at Haiti. The Haitian rice farmers have basically been put out of business by heavily subsidized U.S. rice. And you have to think about, Haiti's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. How is it possible that the richest country in the world could undercut Haitian farmers selling their own rice, drive them off the land and into Port-au-Prince and the slums, and then the earthquake, which then devastated and killed 50,000 people. 1 million people are still homeless in Haiti. Actually, not a single dollar of US aid has reached Haiti yet from the government, not $1. 1 year later. And so, you know, the list of examples I could give of what has crushed the developing world in terms of that kind of paradigm, where neoliberalism, the opening up of markets only for developing countries and not for developed, has made, another example, in West Africa, you can actually buy frozen offal from Smithfield that was manufactured, grown in, the animals were raised in Eastern Europe and then transported to Western Africa, Sierra Leone and so on. You can buy frozen offal from Smithfield's East European concentrated animal feeding operations. They're not even called farms anymore. Cheaper than you can buy fresh local meat in the markets. And so, of course, that means that those farmers are driven out of business. In the same way, I mentioned it earlier in the other talk, that if you're a farmer, you don't appear on the 2010 census in the United States anymore, because if you're less than 0.5% of the population, your demographic doesn't exist. So they took farming out of the US census. You can't put that down as an occupation, which is absolutely crazy, right? When you think about that we eat food to stay alive. And so, you know, there's, on the one hand, 1 billion people who are undernourished, underfed, starving, and also 1 billion people who are suffering from diabetes type 2, overweight, obese, etc., and are still also malnourished. And so we've got this crazy system where you've got 1 billion people who are underfed and then 1 billion people who are overfed, but not nutritionally actually in any way healthy. And so what is driving that? Well, the UN last year reported that what would it take to feed those 1 billion people who don't have enough food? And they calculated that it would take, to eradicate world hunger, $44 billion. So a drop in the ocean, right? $44 billion to feed the planet, and yet they go hungry. Whereas the Pentagon, for example, the Pentagon's budget is $700 billion. So it's not that the money doesn't exist. There are other priorities of the system. And so one of the main contentions of this book that I wrote, amongst other things, is that we're not going to get any ecological justice without some social justice. And we need to fight for both things simultaneously and connect all the different movements together. One of the reasons that I'm a socialist is ultimately I think the system itself is not only anti-human in the way it exploits and oppresses the human population of the planet, but also exploits the non-human and the planet itself, right? The idea is, the whole point of this system really is to generate more and more money. What the system of capitalism itself is based on the idea, I mean, the classic definition of the purpose of capitalism was given in 3 letters by Karl Marx, right? MC, M prime. You start with money, M. You turn it into a commodity, C. And then you sell that commodity and you make more money, M prime. And then what do you do with that extra money? You turn it around and you reinvest it back in the production process. The production process expands, and then you start all over again. So this is a system out here that is based on endless expansion. And that makes a logical contradiction, right? We live on a finite planet, and yet we cannot live within an economic and social system predicated on constant growth. And we see that today. If the economy here in the United States is not expanding at 2 or 3% every year, then layoffs, unemployment, cuts to social programs, foreclosure crisis, etc., etc., etc. No cuts to the defense budget, of course, but everything else has to go on the chopping block and destroy people's lives by the hundreds of thousands and the millions in this country and around the world. And so that really kind of, what is the, and then why do they even make stuff, right? Why are we engaged in this growing expansion of production? Not even to make things that we actually can use. Most of the time it's stuff that has no use, right? There are 2 different ways of defining value. You've got the use value, what you're going to use it for, right? And then there is the exchange value. How much are you going to get when you sell it? And under this system of capitalism, exchange value is always going to be more important than use value. We could give any number of examples, but just very briefly, HIV medication. Millions of people around the world need HIV medication, right? But if those same people, or food, for example, if those same people do not have the money to buy it, it just won't get manufactured in the required amounts. Or if it is, it will be restricted from their use. They're not going to give it away for free because that's going to drop the price, and supply will go up, and therefore cost will go down. They won't make a profit. So they will not allow, it's better to starve people than feed people under this system, and they do that obviously very effectively. Then on the other hand, we have things with a very high exchange value. Yeah, there's plenty of space down here. If you'd like to sit at the front, it's not too terrifying, hopefully.
I'm a front row guy, you know.
All right. So things, some things have a very high exchange value, and so they are manufactured in enormous quantities. Weapons, for example, no use value, and yet very, very profitable. And so, you know, the list could go on and on. So those are 2 aspects of the system. The fact that it's based on continuous expansion in the pursuit of profit, and that exchange value is more important than use value, that make this system, I would argue, inherently anti-ecological. The third thing is that it's impossible to have long-term planning, or any kind of planning, really, outside of individual corporations. They all produce as quickly as possible to get it to market and undersell and outcompete the next company down the road sooner. And so long-term planning, which is impossible here, is the exact thing that we need right now. There was 3 reports released by the US Academy of Sciences last year, one of which I'll just briefly quote from. There are still some uncertainties, and there always will be, in understanding a complex system like Earth's climate. Nevertheless, there is a strong, credible body of evidence based on multiple lines of research documenting that climate is changing and that these changes are in large part caused by human activities. While it is clear that the Earth's future climate will be unlike the climate that ecosystems and human societies have become accustomed to during the last 10,000 years, the exact magnitude of the future climate change and the nature of its impacts will always remain somewhat uncertain. So, the US National Academy of Sciences is saying that climate will be unlike anything that we have known in the last 10,000 years. Well, that period is exactly coincides with the rise of human civilization, right? If you cannot predict the climate and what's going to happen, how are you going to grow crops and have agriculture? And so if we go down that road, obviously that creates immense problems for the continuation of things, of human society on the kind of scale and extent that we have now. That was 10 minutes, I think. So the question kind of comes about, well, what are we going to do about this, right? And now I think, for a long time, I think for climate justice activists, it's been kind of difficult, and for a lot of people, it's been really difficult to think about, well, where do I get involved? What do I actually organize around and do when what we're talking about is having to change the entire nature of everything, right? Our transportation system, our energy system most urgently, or how we get around, how our buildings are made or not made, how our food supply comes about, and rearranging agriculture, all of these cultural changes, lots and lots, everything needs changing, and a complete paradigm shift in all aspects of our life. So it's like, well, what am I going to do about that? And I think it becomes it's paralyzing, right? It's difficult to know where to insert yourself as an activist. But I think one of those areas is certainly looking at one example that I talked about earlier is the budget cuts that are coming about. But in terms of ecological questions, there were three things that President Obama spoke about in his State of the Union address last year, when he said these are the things that we're going to focus on for a clean energy future. Those three things were clean coal, which doesn't exist, right? Offshore drilling, more offshore drilling for oil. And thirdly, clean, safe nuclear power. Three words that don't logically coexist in the same sentence. But those three areas are exactly the three that we've had energy crises and catastrophes in over the last year. The West Virginia Upper Big Branch mine explosion that killed 29 mine workers, mining for coal. Obviously the BP oil spill last summer that went on for months. And now we have the ongoing crisis in Japan around nuclear power. And the US State Department has said that, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission here has said that they want all Americans 50 miles away from that nuclear plant. And that's what they're advising people to do. Well, 1 in 4 Americans in this country live within 50 miles of a nuclear plant. There are 104, more than any other country in the world. 23 of them were built in the 1960s on exactly the same design as in Japan. And there's one not far up the road, right, San Onofre. It's on the beach of all kind of crazy places. California actually is predicted to have a 7 or greater earthquake at 99.7% probability within the next 30 years. So the nuclear plants in California and around the US in general are only built to withstand a 7 to a 7.5. And so could it be greater than that? Do we have any evidence to support the idea that we could have a worse earthquake in California than that? Well, yes, because it's already happened, right? The 1906 San Francisco earthquake was 8.3. So the idea that, so I think, thinking about where we could start in terms of what we could do to build a new movement for ecological and social justice, I think getting rid of nuclear power would be a great place to start. People are really worried about radiation coming from Japan, and that's obviously legitimate. We can talk about that. How realistic, how worried should we be at this point? But I think we should be far more worried about the nuclear plants that already exist here. And I don't think we need to wait for an accident on the scale of what's going on in Japan, obviously, to start that campaign. And I think that could be a good way to reinvigorate a climate justice movement where we have an obvious point of attack. We could shut down the nuclear plants, and that would be a way of looking at, well, what do we really mean by clean energy? How can it be relicensing these 40-year-old dilapidated nuclear plants for another 20 years and building more that will operate for another 40 or 50 years? Because then when are we talking about clean energy? Not till the end of this century, basically, if then. And the US government has said that they will keep things safe with nuclear waste, even though there is no plan anywhere in the world to deal with it, for 1 million years. That's what they say that they can do. 5 times longer than Homo sapiens have been in existence. They can build containers that are going to be okay. And so obviously the longer, I mean, this is how crazy it is, right? The longer that we go on with this, the worse it gets. And just to talk about nuclear power, because I think one of the things, there's been a big focus on accidents, but I don't think we need to stop there, right? There are loads of reasons to be against nuclear power. I'll quote from a US State Department report on the international control of atomic energy that was released in 1946, drafted by Robert Oppenheimer, amongst others. Quote, "The development of atomic energy for peaceful purposes and the development of atomic energy for bombs are in much of their course interchangeable and interdependent." And so you actually can't have a nuclear weapons program without a civil nuclear program. The two things go together. It's the exact same technology. You either enrich your uranium to 3 to 5% and stick it in a power plant, or you enrich it to 80 to 90% and put it in a bomb. But the process is identical. And that's why the 4 countries, the 4 undisclosed nuclear powers with weapons, are all in some of the most violent and unstable places in the world. So we're fueling a new, even more terrifying arms race. But they also all developed out of civil nuclear programs. So Israel, Pakistan, India, and North Korea. And you have to think about, well, what was it about Japan, the only country to feel the effect of the dropping of nuclear weapons, right? 250,000 people dead in the first 5 years. Why did they decide to go towards nuclear? What was it about the world political system that drove that response by that country? And that kind of starts to look at the imperial geostrategic issues that relate to the way in which the system operates today. Alexei Yablokov is a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He advised President Gorbachev during the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. He was asked recently, when they say that you don't have to worry about the radiation in Japan and stuff like that, what should your response be? And he was in charge of the cleanup at Chernobyl. He said, when you hear, quote, "no immediate danger from nuclear radiation, then you should run away as far and as fast as you can." And that was his advice to people in Japan. And so, we've been told over and over again that this is something that couldn't happen, right? There couldn't be an earthquake that big, there couldn't be a tsunami that big. If there were any of these things that couldn't happen, then it didn't matter because the nuclear plant was safe at 2, and that couldn't happen. And obviously all of those things have happened, but don't worry, it couldn't happen in the United States. In 2007, when Obama was running for president, he commented on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in this country, and he said the problem with it is in bed with the industry that it's meant to be regulating. That's an almost direct quote. And we've, of course, heard that before, right, with the Minerals Management Service and the BP oil spill, where they were literally in bed with in sex and drug parties with the people that they were supposedly regulating. So I think we should be very concerned with that, and I think that does give us a point of insertion into talking about nuclear energy and why we need to get rid of it. And I think that that's kind of a winnable possibility, right? It's not. If we can close down the old plants immediately, argue for that, and then work on getting rid of it. I think there are other areas that movements are growing in this country, things like mountaintop removal of coal. It's not the whole coal industry, but if we can get that kind of victory and get that stopped, then we can work on eradicating coal. The movement against hydrofracking, if people haven't seen the excellent documentary Gasland, highly recommend it. Because I think that these are things that we can start talking about building real social movements. The biggest demonstration ever in New York City in 1982 was against nuclear power and nuclear weapons, 750,000 people. So if they did it in the 80s, we can certainly do it again now. And I think there's a lot of people who are trying to work out what is the connection between the economic crisis of 2008, the food crisis of the same year, and the ongoing and growing ecological crisis. What is it that connects those kind of three things? And I would argue that the root of this system, the way it operates in the first place, is the problem. And so I think we need to be doing two things. One is, what can we work on right now? We can talk about that. In order to win some victories, because I think that's really important. We need to win, whether they're big or small. We need to start fighting and winning some things. Thanks. For two reasons. One, to make our lives better, right, and gain confidence to build on that. And also, secondly, to buy us some time, because things are pretty urgent, as I was just quoting from the Academy of Sciences report. But I also think we need to have a completely different vision of what an actual sustainable society would look like. So half of the book that I wrote is about a critique of false solutions and the way that the system currently operates, why it operates, in whose interests does it operate and doesn't it. And then the second half of the book is really about short-term solutions that we can fight for and hopefully win. And then a vision of what a totally different society would look like. And I think it's really important to look at some of the issues surrounding nuclear power. There's just a report out today in the Times where 89% of the workers at the plant in Fukushima were in fact day workers on no pay, day-long contracts. 81% of nuclear workers in Japan are actually temporary workers because they can pay them less. They were saying in the most dangerous places, current and former workers said radiation levels would be so high that workers would take turns approaching a valve just to open it, turning it for a few seconds before a supervisor with a stopwatch ordered the job to be handed off to the next person. These are untrained people who are desperate for work. They're now being offered $350 to $1,000 a day to go back into the plant and do the most dangerous things. So these are farmers who've been kicked off their land, had to go out, or day laborers who need to come in. And this is the safest nuclear system in the world, supposedly, right? We're the most prepared society for disasters. And if they're doing it in Japan, you better believe they're doing it in this country. Similar things. And so, the idea that they should be, there was a report by the Union of Concerned Scientists just a little while ago, about a month ago, citing 14 near misses in the last 12 months at nuclear plants in this country, all of which could have led to a meltdown. They didn't, but there was one where a leaking pipe was left unnoticed for 18 months. And so there are daily little accidents that go on all the time because they're constantly, there's a constant drive to make more money and cut corners. And nuclear is so resoundingly non-economic that even, The Economist, for example, in 2001 issued a report saying the nuclear power, once too cheap to meter, is now too costly to matter. In 2009, Citibank released another report. Citibank has rarely met a risky investment that it would say no to, as we all know, right? And they released a report saying the economics say nuclear power, the economics say no. According to Wall Street Journal, nuclear power is 12 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour, whereas wind, solar, etc., real alternatives are about 6 cents a kilowatt hour on average. So half the price of nuclear power. And seeing as they lie constantly about the real costs of nuclear power, they've got no idea what to do with the waste, let alone all the safety issues, then that would be a good enough reason to be against it in the first place, I think. Plus, if they pile all that money into nuclear, there's going to be no money left over for generating real alternatives. So it actually actively undermines any real alternative. And you can see that directly in Japan, where the renewable sector in Japan is 0.3% of their energy supply, because they have 30% of their energy from nuclear. So I think that is an important thing to look at. And I think we need to look at some of the real solutions. And I'll talk about, I guess, kind of what we need to think about longer term in a bit. But if we don't look at what the underlying causes of the ecological crisis are, then I think we can be led in very many wrong directions. And those kind of come under three different overall rubrics. One is technological, right? There's always going to be some technological silver bullet that is going to save us. So we're going to bury carbon under the ground, we're going to have safe nuclear power plants, we're going to put iron filings into the ocean to absorb the CO2 by boosting phytoplankton production. We're going to put trillions of mirrors into, these are all real plans, by the way. We're going to put trillions of tiny mirrors in space to reflect sunlight. Estimated cost $5 trillion, just so that we can continue with, the system as it currently exists, right, with the gas stations and the roads and the military and so on. Or we can shoot tens of thousands of artillery shells filled with sulfur to reflect sunlight back into space. These are all actively being researched as solutions. If it's not a technological solution, then we're offered things around what we need is really more of the market, right? More of the market, the thing that created this situation in the first place. We need to expand it into all areas of life. So that's where cap and trade comes from, that idea where we can validate and make money from what used to be regarded as pollution. That's how mad this system is. You can now make money from trading carbon dioxide, right? That's the new market. Alternatively, kind of the third area that we're told where we can make a real difference is really because it's our fault, right? It's either too many poor non-white people in the South having too many kids. That's really the problem behind ecological change, population, which I have a whole chapter on in the book, debunking that idea, blaming poor people. Or it's just our lives that we're just consuming too many things. Now there certainly are some people consuming too many things. The rich, right? There's the Economist from a couple of weeks ago, the rich and the rest, where they have 0.5% of the global population control $69 trillion. And so the idea that some people consume too much is definitely true, right? That's a third of the world, 0.5%, $69 trillion. Or in this country, 400 people have more wealth than 60% of the population. In other words, if the 100 or 60 or 70 people here, if you all got 3 of your mates, right, and got together, that number of people would be the same amount of wealth as the entire population of New York City multiplied by 20. So 400 people have the same amount of wealth as 200 million Americans. That is the level of disparity. It's quite unbelievable. But generally speaking, we're told that what we really need to do is change our lifestyles, right? You watch Al Gore's movie, and part of it is really great, about explaining the science, and then he's like, all of these terrible things are going to happen, the world is going to change, bad things happen, etc., etc. And then he's like, well, pump your tires, change your light bulbs, like absurd disconnection between, on the one hand, the problems that are identified, and on the other hand, the solutions, just in order to justify the system as it currently exists. And so then you end up feeling bad about yourself or guilt-tripping others to be like, well, why aren't you taking environmental situation seriously, and why aren't you doing this, that, and the other thing? And I'm not saying we shouldn't not use bottled water or things like that, right? But I think it has to be a social question, because if we don't identify it as that, then you do end up with things like this from the Times, people feeling bad, well, this is the time, so they're feeling bad about having 2 homes and a swimming pool. Why can't they use non-disposable diapers? But the Miss Earth 2010 competition, where you can actually use sexism to drive ecological sustainability. Applications are invited from beautiful, passionate, eco-warring young women who combine a love for the planet with beauty, poise, and grace. Modernizing the traditional focus of the beauty pageant and bringing beauty contests firmly into the 21st century. Absolutely sick, right? So, and yet this is like a pro-environmental argument from these people. There are lots of restrictions on if you want to think about entering this competition. It gets far worse. You must never have been married, never have had a child, been born female, and so on and so forth. Or there's a campaign in Britain, 10-10, reduce your carbon emissions by 10% by 2010. Not going that well, but they just let in this corporation, MBDA Systems. What do? They make 30,000 missiles a year. Thanks. And so one of the organizers is like, of course, arms manufacturers can reduce their emissions by 10%. What they do with the rest of the time is a different matter on which we couldn't possibly comment. So you can have green arms manufacturers. And actually, there's something in the book about Ray Mabus, the U.S. Secretary of the Navy here, who is quoted as saying he wants to sail the Great Green Fleet by 2030. So the Navy is going to be all green-powered with hybrid biofuels and nuclear-powered submarines when they're dropping bombs around the world. So I think you get trapped in all of these kind of false solutions that are to do with our own individual lifestyle. And as I said, if you could do that, I think that's fine, and you should. But don't confuse that with a political strategy for really making the changes that we want to see, because none of us individually can dismantle a nuclear power plant, right, or build a light rail system in our cities. And those are the kind of things that actually will make a difference. You can also have, if you want to go out and check out this book, which is kind of interesting, you can have Sustainable Love Life. You could get this book, Eco-Sex, Go Between the Sheets and Make Your Love Life Sustainable, by a new book by Stephanie Weiss. I'm all for sustainable sex, but I think let me just quote from the publicity material here. Leaving a smaller carbon footprint in the bedroom is easy with Eco-Sex, a green sex guide that will inspire both sexual and ecological excitement. Yeah. Nothing quite like thinking about reducing your carbon footprint to get you a little hot under the collar. Renew your passion for the environment while you recharge your love life with green sex toys, low-impact lingerie, fair trade biodegradable condom, bamboo bed linens, hand crank vibrators, conflict-free diamonds, and much more. I may not be as experienced as I should be with that use of a vibrator, but hand crank vibrators does strike me as something of a contradiction in terms when you actually think about it. Obviously we need some more serious things to do, and I pointed to some short-term things, but I also think we need to look at what would it mean, actually, and I'll finish on this, what would it really mean to have a high quality of living, right? What does that actually translate into? Because we're told what it translates to here is to collect more stuff, right? You make more money, you work harder, you spend more hours at your job or jobs, and you collect and buy more things, and you live in a bigger house, and so on and so forth. So in exchange, obviously, you lose any level of free time or any sense of community or any number of other things. But what I would argue is high quality of life has got nothing to do with any of those things, and I'm sure people would agree with me. Whereas, what would it mean to actually have the free time where you're only working 4 hours a day because we're employing everybody in things that we actually need to do? And right now, of course, there are millions of jobs that we need doing. We need a whole new infrastructure, a whole new energy infrastructure, and so on, a whole new sewage system that actually functions properly. So we need millions of real green jobs that we should fight for, because there's millions of unemployed people too. But what about having the time to enjoy a sense of community, to appreciate culture and art, to build yourself up as a human being and understand what it actually means to eat a leisurely meal? Because these days, when we talk about we live in a democracy, and we are the ones, consumer decisions matter, who the hell asks for fast food? I mentioned this earlier. I've been on loads of demonstrations in my life. I've never been on one where people were like chanting, feed us crap, just do it faster. And so under a logical system, obviously fast food wouldn't exist, and neither would we have to have a new separate category of food, organic food, because the other stuff, the swill that they feed us otherwise, is so polluted and poisonous in many, many respects. We would actually think, how could we reconnect with the land, right? Because we're completely separated from urban and a rural environment. And it's no coincidence the dawn of capitalism 400 years ago that the first thing they did was privatize the land, right? They kicked us off the land with the Enclosure Acts and so on, and forced us into the cities so we could go and work in their factories for them and make money for them. And so how would we re-envision a city like San Diego, for example, where people could get around without cars, where there was a genuine public transit system, where, think about the amount of space, apart from the pollution issues and the safety issues and so on and so forth, and the resource that we use to build cars, but the space that they take up, not even when they're driving, but when they're parked. Think about replacing that with green spaces, with free swimming pools, with any number of things that we could do, and investigate and try and understand and live within nature as opposed to separated off from it. Because I think one of the big things that capitalism has done to us is try to present this view that we're completely independent of nature. Nature is over here, we could take stuff from it, anything we want, and we can dump stuff back in, and we can just continue to live as if the planet doesn't even really connect to us in any real systemic way. And yet, of course we're a part of nature. And one of the things that inspired me to get into Marxism and Marx was his writings and Engels' writings on our deep interconnection and interrelationship with the natural world. And so that is something that really inspires me to kind of get back to doing that, where we don't have to worry about being inundated with radiation or all of the chemicals that we have in our bodies right now that are never going to go away because of the way that the products are manufactured. Even if you eat healthily, everybody here has about 200 chemicals in their bodies that wouldn't have been there 50 years ago. 97% of Americans have detectable levels of BPA in their bloodstreams and urine, just from the way products are manufactured. And so it's not even like you can escape and say, well, I'm going to live healthily, eat healthily, etc., etc. You certainly can't escape should there be a nuclear accident. And so I think it's really urgent that we get around to changing that and doing something about it, and talking about how can we organize a fight back around small issues in San Diego, on campuses, in communities, and try to pull together a national movement for ecological and social justice with a vision for completely getting rid of the current system ultimately, because I think capitalism is completely unsustainable. You can see that from the food system, and they continually promise to feed everybody, and they can't even do that. And so how could we also not just look at things that we can win right now, but what would a totally different sustainable society really look like, where we are the ones, I think a society based on three things. Instead of competition, cooperation. Instead of this sham democracy where we get to make decisions about almost nothing, real democracy based on the people and the communities that make the stuff, where we decide the stuff that we need is going to be made because we need it, not because it makes a profit. So it has a use value without talking about exchange value. And so I think cooperation, democracy, and production for need, not profit, are the three things that I would say must underpin a really sustainable society, and re-envisioning, because we don't actually even know what it means to be human, right? We are so warped, so alienated individually from the land, from each other, from our own sexualities, that we barely understand what it even means to be a species based on cooperation, which is how we actually evolved. And so I think that that's something worth fighting for. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. So unfortunately, we do have a little bit of a limited time for this session. So we're going to have some time for discussion, and you feel free to direct questions to Chris, but also feel free to direct comments or questions to the group. And I want to really encourage everyone to participate. If you want to introduce yourself, say your name when you speak. I'm going to keep a list, so just raise your hand anytime, and I'll kind of keep a list of people who want to say something. And because we are so limited on time, I am going to keep people to a 2-minute time limit, so that way the most people possible can speak. So when you hit a minute and a half, I'll tell you 30 seconds. When you hit 2 minutes, I'll tell you to wrap up. And very quickly, I'm just going to pass around a flyer. Both Chris and myself are part of the International Socialist Organization. We have meetings in San Diego, and we also have an email list. So I'm going to pass those around so people can get that information. I have...
Hey, my name's Kevin. I just would love to hear your take on danger levels with radiation coming over from Japan. If you could touch on that.
Did you want to come back
No.
on that now or wait?
No.
Okay. So he'll come back on that in a little bit, and then.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Laura. I think one thing that's interesting, like they talk about nuclear power being safe, but they don't talk about all the lawsuits from stuff leaking into groundwater that has killed and caused disease, like horrible disease process, cancer, genetic abnormalities that can never be fixed, in people who've had toxic chemicals that are used to contain other toxic chemicals leaked into their groundwater. So it's already proven that it's not a safe way to get power. So, I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is how does all this stuff happen, and it's still like there's still this big push for saying that nuclear power is safe when there have been known cases. I mean, even popular movies about it. So I'm like, it's just kind of frustrating that they still fit in the same line of this is the best way for us to get power. And I'm honestly curious if San Onofre has ever had any of those problems, if anybody knows about that.
Hi, I'm Hugh Warren. You were saying earlier that the Union of Concerned Scientists were unable to make projections on what the climate was going to be like, and so therefore it affects our ability to create agriculture.
Yeah.
And I mean, I find that hard to believe. The projections are plenty available out there. I see them on the line. I read an article yesterday about a projection that indicated changes in temperature in the southwest that will actually increase real estate values in San Diego. Now, I understand that those projections are hardly the accuracy that scientists would like to believe, but those projections are real. In fact, most of them are so bad that the projection indicates that there's nothing we can do. I went to a lecture about 2 years ago from a Scripps scientist who, at the end of the lecture, I asked specifically, so what is the true reason here? What can we really do? And really put her on the spot, and her answer basically was, well, we're not telling people because we're not sure there is anything that can be done.
Wow.
And we're afraid to say how bad it is, because if we do say how bad it is, then people will give up. They'll just drive their SUV because they've only got so much time to live anyway. So I have two questions for you if you get back a chance to it. How much do you think scientists are really not telling us the truth because they're concerned with us giving up and doing something, or are they not telling us the truth because they don't want to put their projections out there because their funding gets cut off because of how they are funded to do their current work, and how much pressure they get from that angle?
I have an open list right now, and as I mentioned, I really would encourage people to raise their hands anytime because I'll just keep the list.
Yeah, my name is Cecile, and I just wanted to make a quick comment that Laura actually made me think of something when I was in college. I learned about an area in the Mississippi called Cancer Alley because of all of the pollution from like Dow Chemical and all these plastic production plants that are allowed due to deregulation to spill their waste into the Mississippi River, and that the toxics in the Mississippi River from this waste goes into the groundwater. So you want to talk about food justice? These are people who are trying in that area, largely African American, trying to grow their own food because they're so poor, and they actually get cancer from the tomatoes that they're growing in their own backyards. And you have like this enormous prevalence of cancer in young people, like even 8-year-old children who have cancer in this area. And there's no ecological or economic justice because even when the people sued the state of Mississippi to regulate the companies to stop the spilling of these toxic chemicals into their groundwater, the state just basically refused to listen. Even, I can't remember if it was the ACLU or another group, helped them, joined in the lawsuit against the state, and the state won because the state represents the interests of Dow Chemical and corporate companies instead of these people who are easy to ignore because they're poor black people. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is like, how is it that, this food justice conference is about people who obviously are looking for an alternative, right? We want to be able to grow our own food. We know the system isn't working. We know the food that we're fed from corporations is not healthy. So we want to build an alternative. And community farmers are overwhelmingly cooperative, and they share their food. I mean, the food that we shared today over lunch. And so we're trying to build an alternative, but it doesn't stop the source at the system at the source, and it doesn't guarantee that the soil itself is even going to be healthy when we're trying to grow our own food and so forth. So what do we do to actually change on a systemic level how we live in a practical way right now?
Chris is going to come in and respond to a few things.
Well, just on the climate question, what I'd said, the quote was about the fact that you can't, climate will be unlike anything that we've known for the last 10,000 years. In other words, we know that it's going to change radically. So scientists, we've already gone up 1.4 Celsius from the average over the last 20,000 years. And most scientists are congregated around the idea that we need to stay within 2 Celsius. So we've already gone up 1.4. There's not much wiggle room left. Whether beyond that, it starts to become self-reinforcing. So once you've got beyond 2, you're kind of heading for 3 and 4, and then large areas of the Earth are going to be completely unrecognizable. The Southwest, for example, a lot of the water in California obviously comes from the Rockies. If the glaciers if the snow melts really early in the year and turns into rain, then it all comes down at once. And then you've got, what are you going to do in August, September, etc., when there's no water left because the snow melt has not been a gradual, continuous feed. It's already all gone. And that's going to raise huge questions for living in California and the Southwest in general as that occurs. And that's just one example of things that are going to happen. And so, I mean, I think that there's been a huge re-emergence of the idea of McCarthyism against science. I mean, my background is in science. The West Virginia Attorney General wants to put on trial climate scientists it's a real thing, to testify why they are saying the things that they're saying about climate. So there's been a huge reaction against scientists, but it's also politicizing them because they're like, look, we're just trying to put the facts out, and we're not even allowed to say that because it goes to the heart of the way that the system operates. And so that's why it's become so political, and why climate science is intensely a political question, even though it's founded in science, or it should be, and therefore supposedly objective. And then just on the pollution question, well, 1 in 5 uranium miners from the Southwest has some form of cancer. So it's the workers also. It's not just everybody else, because the mining and refining of uranium which they never count in the cost for nuclear, is intensely polluting. And they want to reopen all of those mines in the US so that we can be energy independent. And that's one of the things, the question, why do they continue when it's so uneconomic? Even from their own people, Citibank, The Economist, is saying this is a disastrous, why would we do this? It's way too risky. Why do they do it? They insist on it for 3 reasons, really. One is its connection to nuclear power, as I mentioned. And you can't be a great power in the world, as defined, right, unless you've got nuclear weapons. Therefore, you need nuclear power. So there's huge geostrategic reasons for nuclear civil programs to have a nuclear weapons program. And then the idea, again, geostrategic energy independence, that they don't want to. This is from 2 days ago, actually a special issue of the Times. Can we do without the Mideast? Because they're actually having some democracy there. How terrible! And maybe they're not going to sell us their oil to quite the extent that they used to. We can't control the place as we would want to, which is one of the reasons they want to keep bombing Libya, by the way. It's got nothing to do with caring about Libyan people, of course. But every single article in here about nuclear, clean coal, biofuels, all of it, there's nothing in here at all about reducing overall oil use, only about changing the source of it. So nuclear, we can't rely on the Middle East, right? It's not our dictatorship playground. anymore because the people are in revolt. And so that's one of the main drives behind nuclear power also. France and Japan for that matter, no coal, no oil, no gas. So nuclear became the answer because they didn't want to depend. I mean, if you live in a rational world, first of all, we'd have no borders, right? Because they're totally artificial. We don't need countries. And in fact, that's the only collective that gets validated, right? The national collective. You've got to be for your country and against everybody else. But we can abolish that. What could we do then? How could Japan actually have a sane, rational energy system, for example, where they didn't feel the need to generate it within Japan, but they could use the regional resources from around China and Southeast Asia and so on, wind and solar, etc., to combine that into an actual system where it didn't require being under the US nuclear umbrella. Or, the headwaters of the Nile are leading to massive conflicts between the countries as they build dams. Each country is building a dam all the way down the Nile, which, as you go further down, gets worse and worse for the water and the agriculture. That will eventually lead to a resource war under this system. But if you abolish the countries and you start cooperating, then you can actually have a system that is ecologically sound and equitable, which is impossible under this system. Just on the San Onofre plant, I know that the other one near here, Diablo Canyon, was built by Bechtel, which is a big weapons manufacturer in their own right. When they installed the several thousand ton nuclear reactor there, they put it in backwards. It was a huge scandal in the 1970s. So the idea that these people know what they're doing, and obviously at the cost of several $1 billion to turn it around. And so that I think we should be very worried about that. Should we be worried about radiation? Well, at this point, they've already detected elevated levels around the country, right, of cesium and iodine. These isotopes are dangerous. I don't know whether people want me to go into it. Iodine is dangerous, particularly if you inhale it. It has a pretty short half-life, 8 days, so it decays pretty quickly in a few months. But it goes straight to your into your thyroid, which regulates growth and so on. So particularly for growing people, children, it's a real danger. Cesium and strontium, the other radioactive isotopes which are coming out, have half-lives much longer, 30 years, so they're going to be around for decades. Cesium is very similar to potassium, and you need that for your nerves. So that's what regulates our ability to move. So you will be replacing your potassium ions, in your bloodstream with cesium ions as an electrolyte. And then strontium is very similar to calcium. So you will be absorbing and building your bones with strontium instead of calcium. So you'll be incorporating radioactive particles into you. So that's one of the things that makes it so dangerous. Not so much on your skin necessarily, although that can be obviously bad depending on your exposure, but it's also the length of time that you're exposed to it. So if you take it into your body through inhalation or eating food and stuff, that's really dangerous. So at the moment they're saying it's only trace levels. Difficult to know what goes on with the nuclear industry, obviously. But there are reports that coming from Japan that the leak could be far worse than they're admitting to. I'll just quote from the other day, the Deputy Director General of the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, which is the same as the NRC here. He said, we will have to continue cooling for quite a long period. Pouring seawater, I mean, they've run out of everything else, right? They're just throwing seawater into it. We should be thinking years. That's how long they think they need to be doing it for. And then a professor in a Japanese university's physics said, the worst case scenario is that meltdown makes the plant's site a permanent grave.
Wow.
So they've already not been able to pick up any of the dead people who died during the flood yet because they're too highly irradiated from the site. So at the moment, what is unsafe is within, they've evacuated several 100,000 people from within 12 miles of the site, and they're going to be without their homes for potentially years or potentially forever, right? Imagine what that would look like over here. But other people are saying it should be 50 miles. So at the moment it seems okay here, but we don't know where it's going to go. And there are some physicians who will argue that there is no safe level of radioactivity. Even trace amounts are going to increase cancers and so on. So I think it's an urgent question that we close down the plants, starting with the ones here. There've already been huge demonstrations in Germany. 50,000 people spread for 45 kilometers actually between two cities to a nuclear plant, and the German government has already put them on hold. They were going to relicense just like they were here, and they've shut them down, shut 3 of them already, and they're talking about shutting all the rest, which is like really exciting.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really great. As a direct result, and then just last week, 500,000 Germans went onto the streets to protest nuclear power. They've already put moratoriums in Japan, in India, in a couple of other countries. Here, the Obama administration has said nuclear is totally safe. We should continue, and they just relicensed Vermont Yankee nuclear plant, which was designed to be shut down. The city had voted to shut it down, and it was overruled by the NRC. Even in light of the Japanese crisis, they relicensed it, and it's been leaking radioactive tritium for decades. So I think we'd have to build a really big movement here, but I think it's possible. Oh, sorry, what?
I think we're going to wrap up. So did you want to make any... I'm sorry, time went by a lot faster than we thought it would, so we're going to have to kind of wrap up, and I know not many people got to ask questions, so I want to just see if Chris has any final thoughts. Or
Yeah, I mean, are there any other questions that people want to ask or anything? I'm sorry, I didn't realize the time either. But we started a little late because it was hard to find this place. So if people want to hang around for a little while, I know that there's a plenary starting in a few minutes, right? But if people have other questions and stuff they want to ask, or talk about, more informally organizing in the San Diego area to start doing something, then I think that would be a good use of people's time to kind of exchange contact. I'm not from here, but people can exchange contact information and talk about what could happen in San Diego, because I think some of these questions are also linked to the budget cuts, right? Because if they cut things from social programs, where are they also going to be cutting? Well, safety, health, and so on and so forth. And so I think that's an important question too. So if people have other questions or thoughts, I know that we have to wrap up, so sorry, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I know we're trying to work everybody in and within the time that we have. I did have a couple people put their hands up. If you can keep it really brief, then we'll do that. So.
Yeah, this is under the thoughts category rather than the questions. Just in response to Hugh's question about whether it's too late.
Oh yeah.
I was glad that Chris kind of pointed to a general statement by the Union of Concerned Scientists about things are definitely going to change radically, because it points to the fact that there's so much uncertainty that we don't know, that this is a new science. So it's not clear how severe the built-in changes from right now in the climate are going to be. But even if the changes are radical and going to make life much harder than we would like it to be, that may well make it all that much more urgent to stop continuing to put more CO2 into the atmosphere every year, which is what's happening now. And Chris's book had something that infuriated and gave me hope at the same time, which was that apparently it would cost $400 billion over 20 years to install enough solar energy in the United States to basically create most of the electricity generated in the United States. The solutions are totally cheap, and they can be implemented now. The capitalists will not, because it goes against profit. They have $12 trillion invested in the world oil industry, and if we stop using oil, that $12 trillion is completely written off. That's the reason why they won't spend the puny amount that it would actually take to get us weaned off of the stuff that's driving global warming. And that gives me hope, because it shows that we can change things, but not within capitalism.
Okay. As some people are leaving to get to the other plenary, so I'm just going to make a couple of quick announcements, and then I'm going to let Chris make a final comment. We have copies of his book here from Haymarket Books. They are $14, and he is going to stick around for a few minutes to sign books if you'd like to do that. I wanted to let you know that there's a conference coming up in July. It's the annual Socialism Conference that's going to be in Chicago. A lot of us from San Diego are going to be going to that. It's July 4th weekend. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can talk to myself or Chuck. We can give you information. And then finally, if we could just really quickly give a round of applause to the organizers of this event, and specifically to Cecile, who set up this event. Final thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just say two very, very brief things. It's been calculated, a number of different studies have shown that if we wanted to power the whole planet with actual renewable energy, we would have to build between now and 2030, 20 years' time, we would need to build 3.8 million wind turbines, large wind turbines, and 90,000 solar arrays. Now, over a 20-year period, and that would be around about 500 billion or so. A drop in the ocean when you think about each year of the Pentagon gets 700 billion. But 3.8 million wind turbines, maybe that sounds like a lot, I don't know. But we make every single year 80 million cars. So the idea that we couldn't make 3.8 million wind turbines and 90,000 solar arrays in 20 years when we manufacture 80 million cars every year, it kind of gives you a sense of the warp priorities and how easy it would be actually to have alternatives. And then the other thing that I would say, I think in terms of what we can do, I mean, I think even if we thought that we couldn't, there's some things that we can't do, right? There's the rates of species extinction are around about 100 to 1,000 times the geological statistical norm. I just got back from collecting data on leatherback turtles over the last couple of weeks, and they've gone through a population crash, 96%. These huge organisms, this big, that have been around for 100 million years, spectacularly successful evolutionarily speaking, and yet there's only a few thousand of them left, because only 1 in 1,000 reaches adulthood. And part of the reason that we're collecting data is to try and work out what's going on. But with that, so there's some things that we're just not going to be able to arrest, and they're critically endangered, which means they're slated for extinction within the next 10 years. These magnificent creatures. So I think that on the one hand is depressing, and you can think, well, let me go and get my Hummer and forget about things, right? But I think that the exciting thing is that millions of people around the world are fighting back. We haven't seen it quite so much in this country, but we're starting to. I'll just read a quick, very, very brief quote. This is January 28th from this year, New York Times. They're talking about Egypt, just after things got going there. The New York Times says, the Egyptian leadership, long accustomed to an apolitical and largely apathetic public, remains convinced that Egypt is going through the sort of convulsion it has experienced and survived before. So that is exactly what they say about us, right, in Americans. Apathetic and apolitical. And obviously that was just a few weeks ago. They quote somebody from a leading member of the regime where he says, quote, I can't think of anybody that I know that has any concern about the stability of the regime. 28th of January. 2 weeks later, no more regime, right? Because millions of people were in the streets. And then did that inspire? Hundreds of thousands in Madison, Wisconsin. Another area of the world where we're told they're backward, they're conservative, they don't care about what goes on in the outside world, etc., etc. And yet I went to that city, and it was incredible to be there. So I think people are ready to start fighting back, and now couldn't be a better time to organize it. And really what I think, after a social revolution, where we overthrow and get rid of these tiny sliver of minority at the top, intent on destroying the planet and us, the level at which we can make change would be so enormous when you think that we could free the 7 billion minds on this planet from their day-to-day drudgery, worried about whether they can actually feed their kids or themselves from day to day. They've got no way of thinking about bigger questions. If we freed them from that, the level of creativity, imagination, the resources that would be freed up if we didn't have to run the military machines. 246 U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan are the same amount of money that it would take for the entire education budget of Afghanistan from kindergarten through graduate school. 246 U.S. soldiers is the cost of that their education program, or would be if it was spent there. Of course, we have 100,000 U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. And so, with reordering priorities, I actually think wherever we are post a social revolution, I really think that it's possible, then I think we can change things, not overnight, obviously, we're not magicians, but I think we could make enormous strides towards righting the wrongs of the world in a very, very short time period, because all of the projections about how quickly we can do it are based on this system, right? Based on an actually rational system where we decide what should and shouldn't be produced. I think we could do it much faster, and that's a really hopeful thought, I think. And looking at the situation in Egypt where they're fighting for those kind of things, we don't know how far it's going to go or what, but that's inspiring to everybody all over the world, and obviously in this country too. So I think we should take heart from that and not be depressed about the state of the world, because it's actually exciting to be an activist. I've been an activist for a long time. It's been bloody depressing. Growing up in the 80s, what a terrible decade that was. But I think things are turning around, and finally we get to find out we've been losing for 30 years. Finally, we've turned it into an actual fight. One of the signs that I saw in Madison, loads of homemade signs, was like they only call it class war when we fight back.
Yeah.
And so that's the exciting. We're actually fighting. So we'll win some, we'll lose some, but the fact that we're fighting is very exciting. So I would urge anybody who's not involved or not in an organization to join one, get involved, get active, because, to quote Frederick Douglass, there is no progress without struggle. And so we need to fight for the things that we want, because otherwise we know the direction the world will go in. We know what they are going to do to it. And so it really is a question of us or them. Thanks very much.